you know that. We also enjoyed the opening session. We will have a small, like a minor change in the program today. So we will have the presentations from our friends Bujo and Alexandros, and then around 2 p.m. instead of tomorrow, Damir Kapičić from Austria will join us via Zoom today at 2. So we'll steal a bit of time from lunch, but like maybe 30 minutes. That's
so
okay.
It's too valuable to miss.
So the idea with this module is to have a theoretical overview of different perspectives, but also to present very concrete practical examples that took place in different places. And one of them is Mostar, and that's why I decided that it would be valuable to have it today online and not to miss it. Then tomorrow we will also have Irena Fiket, and then examples from Belgrade and Poznan. And on the final day, on Saturday, we will join the group on just energy transition and have two presenters coming from or presenting their institutional perspective in this deliberation, including climate issues. So we will move, it's not clear from the program, I'm sorry, we will all move to school on Saturday. That's where we have a joint session. Yeah? Okay, I think that's it all for this module. Jovana will introduce our guests and then we can start. And we encourage you to participate and just like, get engaged as much as possible. 30 minutes for each presentation, okay?
Okay, just to continue in Italy and to present our two presenters, lecturers today. So as Eva said, we are starting from a little bit more abstract or contextual contextualization, let's say, side of the entire module, and then we will dive into the practices and different challenges that those practices deal with. Today we have Bujo Ilić. He's a research fellow at the Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory in Belgrade, but also policy and research advisor at CERTA, which is a non-government organization. And we have Alexandros Kirkiris, sorry, who is an associate professor of contemporary political theory in Aristotle University, Thessaloniki. So first Bujo will go, and then Alexandros. And if you want, however, you want to organize a discussion in questions, you can do it. So, floor is yours.
Thanks. So we agreed that I go first, and then Alexandros will take over. So just a couple of comments. First of all, thank you for inviting us. It's really great to be here. The main caveat is I'll be talking in a very general terms about the bigger picture before we move to specifics tomorrow and the day after. I'm a political scientist. I'll be talking mostly about institutions. I will not be talking about social movements, etc. That's for Alexandros. And I think you will all realize my ideological positions very soon. So every time we talk about this, it comes out. So when we talk about democracy, it's one of those concepts that it's very difficult to explain it. We all think we know what it is, but once we start talking about it, we realize we have different understandings of what it actually means. Generally, we talk about government of the people, a political system in which government is based on the mandate obtained from the citizens who have a right to vote. And when we contrast it to the obvious, other side, it's autocratic systems, it's the absolute monarchies, the military dictatorships, it's theocracies. So it's an easy picture to represent. And what happened in the last couple of decades actually is that, like in 1941, we had only 11 representative democracies in the world. Now, pretty much all countries claim to be democratic in some way. Almost without any exemption, 190 of them. And basically, all of the modern democracies are also representative democracies in some way, which means that they are systems in which citizens democratically elect their representatives. Which means if it has elections, if it has a parliament, if it has parties, which are pretty much universal, we're talking about a representative democracy. It also didn't come out of nowhere in the 20th century. It actually had like around 7 centuries of development. And it might be one of the most important political inventions that we ever made. And it's really important that we see it as an invention and not as a God-given gift. And so it's been extremely successful, this meteoric rise in the 20th century really testifies to that. And I think it's been a little bit of a victim of its own success. It spread basically because it's very hard to claim legitimate rule today without basing it on representative democracy and on the democracy itself. And it also comes with the belief that it's a form of government that's basically synonymous with good governance. And that's especially the case in the last 3 decades. Before that, we had some alternatives. Now, basically, we elect the alternatives for good governance outside of the representative democracy. Now that's being brought into question. And that's the crisis element of it. And it's brought into question for several reasons. I think, first of all, is that it promises a lot, but in reality, it delivers very poorly. That's like a constant drive of poor performance. It's deeply flawed, and maybe there are flaws in the system. And we're still arguing that about it after a couple of centuries. And we don't really know how to fix it. There's no easy way to fix representative democracy, and maybe we can't fix it and we need to abandon it. That's what I'm going to talk about today. But first I want to do a little bit of conceptual cleanup, just to make sure we know what we're talking about when we talk about representative democracy. And I want to delineate it or contrast it to 2 alternative models. One is direct democracy, and one is liberal democracy. So direct democracy is clearly a model in which citizens themselves participate in debate, in decision making, and it's the original meaning of democracy. In Athens, in ancient Athens, all 3 men of the polis participated in the assemblies and decided on issues without any intermediaries. Like the idea of choosing political mediators would be a completely foreign thing. Direct participation in decision making was a rule. It was considered a right of individuals, but it was also thought of education, like it's good for the community that everybody participates. So why would you abandon it? Why would you give away this good idea? And in addition to direct participation, there was another element of the original idea of democracy, and that was, besides these assemblies, there were courts and executive power, and they were selected by lottery. A large number of Athenian citizens, several hundred, were elected by chance into these bodies. And there are estimates that around 30 to 40% of people in their lifetime were at once selected by lot to participate in the government, which is really fulfilling the idea of, everyone rules, everyone is ruled. So that's the direct democracy ideal that is being contrasted to representative democracy. It didn't survive, right? For a multitude of reasons, maybe not the most obvious. The most obvious to us today is that it excluded most inhabitants, the slaves, the foreigners, and so on. But representative democracy also did it up until the 20th century. So that's not the reason why it didn't succeed. It didn't succeed primarily, I would say, because it wasn't suitable for because it was suitable for smaller communities, but not really applicable in larger communities. What works in polis doesn't work in an empire. So it didn't survive. Election, but it did survive. It was maintained in some forms of referenda, citizen initiatives, as well as local assemblies, town hall meetings at lower levels of government. In former Yugoslavia, we have a thing called mesna zajednica, which is the embodiment of direct democracy. The main strength of it, I think, is in empowering citizens to participate in political process. The whole idea is that many people are not interested in politics or don't have enough knowledge, but they learn to participate through participations. It's a virtuous cycle that's really, the biggest promise of direct democracy. The election of lot, the tradition that I was talking about, had a little bit less glorious future. Direct democracy still exists in some forms in modern societies. Election by lot was really popular in the Middle Ages, in Italian cities. And for several reasons that we still don't fully understand in the modern period, it's strangely absent from our notion of democracy. And the big question is, should we reintroduce it, and in what sense? I mean, you find a little bit here and there in how we choose citizen juries and so on, but in reality, we think it's a really fancy thing that we can't really use in the modern day. So what happened is that these historical precedent to the representative democracy that we have today is really the election of representatives. It happened already in the Greek confederations in Rome. There were class elections, and it's a really strange thing to realize this today. But up until 19th century, class elections were the norm. 3 estates, the electing the clergy, the nobility, the commoners, that was the rule up until almost 20th century. Like the idea of a universal suffrage is quite radically new idea. And it all comes to the medieval roots. The kings, in order to raise taxes, had to ask for consent, and then these bodies would consent, but they weren't really elected. And then somewhere in the 17th, 18th century, the idea of representation and democracy came together. Premise to the idea that not all people can be involved all the time. It's really associated with Thomas Paine, the idea that the ancient model of democracy was impossible to transfer to large populations, and that grafting representation onto democracy, we have a form of government that would be that would really unite these different interests that exist in these big polities. In that way, we overcome the physical limitations of the ancient model. There is a good division of labor. Those who want to participate all the time can. Those who want to occasionally participate in elections can. And it was, a novel idea. A lot of people thought it was the worst idea ever. Among them was, of course, Rousseau, who thought that the moment we elect representatives, we lose our freedom. Either this representative democracy is truly representative and therefore it's redundant, or it's not representative, then it's false. And a lot of our discontent with representative democracy can still actually be an echo of these earlier criticisms. And the third thing that I want to contrast with is liberal democracy, because representative democracy didn't stop there, it got another grafting really. Liberal democracy is representative democracy with an additional characteristic that power is limited and basic rights are protected. And I know that the liberalism has, not the best reputation today, but the idea of modern liberalism, which arose at a similar time with representative democracy, is that when we elect these representatives, we really need to protect us from them. And this applies primarily to those who create this ruling majority through this process. So that's another patching. We invent representative democracy and we patch it again. It's a patch after patch after patch until today. We do this through the rule of law. Elected representatives and citizens all have to respect the constitutional legal norms and protect citizen rights and freedoms. And a lot of democracy today is equated with liberal democracy. In some, which I think is false. Like some modern democracy are more liberal, some are less. And the crisis of representative democracy starts with liberalism and ends with the crisis of representative democracy. I'll come to that. To move things forward a little bit and to jump over a couple of things, we realized over time that the economic crises are really detrimental to our representative and liberal democracies. We've had, like in the last couple of centuries, a couple of waves of autocratization. The first wave was this big 19th century expansion of representative democracies in France, in UK, in US, and it's a very slow process. So it was gradual. It was the expansion of the right to vote. First not all men, then women in the 20th century, then ethnic and racial majorities only after the Second World War. And after the Second World War comes the second wave of autocratization, democratization in Germany, in Japan, in new countries after the colonialism, and it's mostly driven by external influence, and a new thing that happens here is political parties. Like mass political parties were not that important up until maybe 60 or 70 years ago. So that's another invention we really have that we have in our system. And the third wave comes in the 70s up to the 1989, where we proclaim there are no alternatives to a liberal representative democracy. And what's really interesting to note here is that besides this, Huntington's version of the three waves, is the three waves of autocratization that we keep talking about in the last couple of years and debate whether they really exist or not. It's based on a very good article by Lurman Lindbergh for a couple of days, which derives from, which departs from empirical data to show us that the quality of democracy receded after this economic crisis. So first, in the 1920s, there was a challenge of fascism, of communism, then after Second World War, military coups in Latin America and Africa, and then the third wave of autocratization that basically starts immediately after we proclaim, it's all finished now, the history of our ideas is kind of closed, and we now live in this third wave of autocratization, especially after the economic crisis of 2008 and the consequences. And what happens here is it's a slow process. It's not sudden process as we had through revolutions, through coups, but democracy dies very slowly, and they die in little stages. So the current crisis of representative democracy is kind of should be seen in this context of continuous autocratization for the last couple of decades. There's a long debate whether representative democracy is always in crisis or we have some peaks. I think both is true. There are systemic features that are always driving the conflicts up. Unlike other systems where we say we live in a harmony, we tend to bring the conflicts up to the surface all the time, but also we need to acknowledge that there are waves in which a lot of countries are in a crisis at the same time. Because I think one of the reasons is that what I said about promises and delivering. More and more people expect more and more from more and more countries. If you translate this to what we really know, there was an expansion of the right to vote. The range of topics that we deal with has really increased. Like the role of the state has changed in the last couple of decades, and the number of states where we have representative democracies has also increased. So when you look at the total, you constantly have some news about some crisis of representative democracy somewhere. So that's what I say, it's been a victim of the success. And the key question really is how responsive the elected representatives are to those who elected them, going back to Rousseau, and how well they represent the interests of those who elected them, or how well they respond to special interests. And when we say special interests, those who have the power. These are, again, far echoes of Rousseau. So let me just read you a passage that I really like by Kim Lane Chappell. I'm very bad at that, reading, so I'll try to do my best. By now we have the pattern. A constitutional democracy, flawed but in reasonably good standing, is hit by a transformative election. A charismatic new leader comes to power, propelled by the growing impatience that the electorate feels with things as they are. The leader promises to sweep away the dysfunctions of partisanship, gridlock, bureaucracy. He claims to call things by their right names and to speak the unspeakable. He rails against entrenched power, entrenched people, entrenched structure. He rallies the people by assuring them that the state belongs to them, and only them. He wins an upset victory over the establishment forces and starts a constitutional revolution. So, what country does this sound like? Pretty much. Hungary, Brazil, Poland, Serbia. I mean, you see states. That's a novel addition. This is the phenomenon that we basically see all the time. We have a thing that it begins with democratic elections, and it continues by abusing democratic institutions rather than abolishing them, which is, I think, also an interesting point. So the main challenge is the dissatisfaction with how things work. These populist actors, they base their support on the representations of dissatisfied citizens, as opposed to political elites or the representatives. And they claim to, represent marginalized sections of the demos. And what they are doing is that they are hyper-responsive, actually, to certain claims, to certain demands. But they are not responsive to the liberal aspects of democracy. And they're especially not responsive to minorities. Every time you see a populist leader, you see that some kind of minority is being targeted. And so how it occurs, simplify the story a lot. Once this upset victory is made, first the critics are being silenced, and by critics I mean everybody who is not the ruling majority. That means the civil sector, that means the academia, that means the political opposition, that means the media. Everybody is being silenced. And then the second thing, the sequencing is really important, it's the capturing of the institutions. So it's basically the liberal checks and balances are being dismantled. either through institutions or through putting your own people out there. And then, only then, after the critics are silent, after the controllers are silent, the institutions that you control the power, you can start organizing unfair elections. And then, representative democracy is meaningless. So first liberal democracy suffers, and then representative democracy. And so, going back to why I said, why it's interesting. So, why do they bother? I mean, the whole process takes years, right? Silencing the critics, changing institutions, it can take like 5-10 years. Because of the legitimacy of democracy and its dominance as a global norm, you still can't say, I won the election, I'm abolishing these institutions. You can't. You have to play the game. And this is again one of the reasons why the crisis is actually the consequence of the success of democracy as a norm. The key deficiency, going back to it, is that in representation we really don't get the responsiveness right. The old dilemma. It's either too little or too much. Too much responsiveness, it's I think obvious. That's the Trump saying he'll drain the Washington swamp. There's a challenge of populism. They are hyper responsive. And whenever there's a gap between expectations and outcomes, there's a gap for populist challenge of democracy. What's really what we don't pay enough attention these days is too little responsiveness. So these are two ways to criticize basically the representative system. So too little responsiveness, that's the old criticism. That's a criticism of the political class, which is a subject of special interest. That's contrasting like professional politicians to amateur voters, the party nature of the representative bodies and so on, and the manifestation of it is the low trust in representative institutions, the low turnout in elections. And this has been an almost constant theme. Like we really see it, empirically in the 60s and the 70s, like the trust in these institutions plummets, social movements go up because they are basically asking for more responsiveness and so on, and low alternative. Like it goes ups and down, but in general it's low. Which brings me to the third part of what I was wanting to say. What are the alternatives? Are there alternatives, or what are the alternatives? The main question is if representative democracies can be reformed at all, or should they be abandoned? I think first of all the reform of representative institutions is possible, but it's rare and painstaking, and we really rarely see. Everything that has to do with elections, with parties, with parliament is subject to change, but it's almost impossible in some cases and very hard in the others. Why is that the case? Well, first of all, they're protected by the Constitution. So we made it hard. We made it difficult for anybody to actually come in and change our institutions. That's part of the system. And the other thing is really, normative, more or less. We thought that this was an important thing, these institutions, and that they are worth saving. And then we started deifying democracy and building civic religions about these institutions. And then, it's a gift of God instead of our own inventions. Like we rarely talk about how new these institutions are and how we came to make them. And just think about the United States and how difficult it is to actually change this system, how entrenched it is. And when you start looking at the problems of this specific representative democracy, you see first of all the electoral system is terrible. It's first past the post majoritarian system, which basically leaves a lot of votes unused. It doesn't represent a lot of voters. Then election manipulation is rampant, and I'm not only talking about gerrymandering, which is a constant way to long-term affect the outcomes of elections, but also about the electoral administration of the United States, which is one of the worst in the world. There is no there is no federal electoral organization. It all comes to states, which can change the rules, which can decide to do it this way or that way. Electoral administration is being basically replaced by the media, who are the arbiters of who won these elections. It's ridiculous, really. And then you go on, the parties are highly oligarchic, and when you look at the policy outcomes of it, it has nothing to do with the people who were voting in it. And so these are, these are real issues, real problems that we can't find institutional solutions as much as we try. And so, I mean, speaking about, making these changes between representative institutions, if we say it's possible, there's a range of things we can do. We can change the electoral systems, like we can change from, majority to proportional, we can experiment with different kinds of things. We can incentivize voting, or we can sanction non-voting, like we say, like the turnout is low, so let's pay people to participate in elections, or let's fine them if they don't. I don't know, we can say the parties are oligarchic, so what do we do? Like we can introduce more intra-party democracy by giving like more party members a chance to affect it and so on. And you can still argue, even if you do all of these things, the basic problems are still going to be there. The issue of responsiveness. And there were authors who were saying this like around hundreds of years ago, that there is this iron law of oligarchy. Whenever you try to make a political organization, it ends up oligarchic. So we can't really have democratic organizations, or criticism that voters are not interested and they really don't care and they are uninformed. So therefore, politics is always about a manipulation game. And we thought that these people were really like critical in a mean way, but actually they were maybe trying to tell us the truth about the representative system. And so the goals of the changes can also go away from representation and to other forms of democracy. And there are a couple of them that I want to introduce. One of them is participatory innovations, which basically says, let's involve more people in the process. It's involving more people in more processes outside of electoral participation. So in between those two electoral cycles, we have a host of innovations that we can, include the citizens in. Think about participatory budgeting, where people decide on how their money is going to be spent. Think about participatory policy making, where there are now legal obligations. It's a new norm basically that representatives can't just like come up with a law. They need to involve the citizens in creating these policies. Or think about participatory planning and all the participatory processes in different new spheres that are opening up. Like I was reading recently, like in environmental protection and so on. So the question is, how much can we do with this? Can we really change these, all of these faults? I would say not that easy, and it certainly participation increases efficacy. It increases our sense that our voice matters and that we can affect, our policy. But it's also elected representatives kind of haters, because there is a trade-off, like higher efficacy, lower efficiency. Everything takes longer time. These people come up with these, solutions that can't work. We need to listen to them. We need to write down. We need to answer. Everything becomes more and more complicated. So there's a wall if you try to push in this direction. And of course, you can always go the other way, and why keep it in formal institutions? You can do this through the civil sector, through social movements, and so on. But so this all is one group of responses to the deficiency. The other thing is, this would be participatory innovation. The other is direct democracy. So what we started with, it basically says these elected representatives are the problem. So we need to get rid of them. Citizens should decide by themselves. It still rests on the assumption of a smaller community, more than the national. But also we translated this to the national level in a sense of, pretty much every country in the world has some aspect of either a referendum or citizen initiative. So we also say, yes, this is doable also on the national level. 20 years ago, we had big expectations that technology is actually going to allow us for a new form of democracy that's going to be constant involvement in decision making through internet and now through apps and so on. The ideas about fluid democracies emerged, and I think still it doesn't respond to the problem that we already identified, and that's that some people will get more involved and some people will get less involved. You can't make everybody involved all the time. And that means that our politics is going to be driven by those who have a higher stake, and those who have more time. What happens in every community meeting? People who are not working, people who don't have house obligations, people who have the luxury to participate, and all the rest, well, they don't. So it's kind of a false promise, and referendums have been notoriously entrenched positions. When you start speaking with parliamentarians, they are there because they were strongly gripping to some policy and some idea, and they want to push it through. If you select citizens by chance, they don't come into this process with preconceived notions or pretty much anything. They have some ideas, but they're not there because of that. And so it's a potential way to break this position, and that's where the deliberation comes in. Just take a couple of minutes more. I think I'm within the time frame. So the deliberative part said that let's gather people together to discuss about some issue based on informed views. So the criticism of representative democracy that had like 100 years, which was right, that people are uninformed and therefore can't make good political decisions, is actually an answer to that. The institutional form is deliberative mini publics or citizen assemblies, which again rests on the theories made in, created in 1960s, 1970s, Habermas, Barber, Pateman, and it's basically the newest addition to our repertoire of what we can do in terms of democratic innovations. It was also a response to this mistrust in institutions that came in 1970s, 1960s, like this big disappointment. It was also a response to anti-expertism and the populist challenges, because the deliberation has to involve some sort of expertise. And it's also an answer to global challenges, because basically when the issues are becoming such that they are polarizing and political, you need to come up with some